welcome back to people who were in our first panel, and welcome to those who just joined us. I would like to again begin by thanking the NSSR Faculty Research Fund and our institutional sponsors, India-China Institute, the Economics Department, and the Global Studies Program. And again, we want to extend our gratitude to people who are helping us with all the logistical work and IT support work. And we also want to thank the two student moderators, Michael and Agnes. And Agnes is going to help co-facilitate the discussion in this panel. And with that, I'm giving the floor to Karina for more introduction.
Great. Thank you so much, Ying, for that introduction. And I also just would like to thank, again, all of the panelists and all of the and the audience as well, those who have remained on the webinar, as well as new folks who have joined. For those who have remained on the call and the webinar, you have seen and participated in the excellent discussions that Ying just described. Our open session gave us much food for thought and equipped us with valuable empirical, conceptual, and theoretical tools that can help challenge the prevailing narratives about China and its relations with the African continent. And also, we should mention here that the first session and this session are both recorded. So if you missed the first session, you'll have a chance at a later time to catch up and learn from the excellent presentations that we have covered. So these tools enable us to rethink African development prospects, aiming to break from a centuries-long cycle of colonial and neo-colonial wealth drain and exploitation on the African continent. I think a crucial aspect that was discussed on the panel was the potential positive impact of Chinese direct investment, but also thinking through some of the limitations as well as contradictions that emerge in the current conjuncture, emphasizing the need of African states to leverage such investments in ways that prioritize working class needs, dignity, visions of liberation, including the need for structural transformation, which would entail food and energy sovereignty, as well as a development that avoids the harmful ecological devastation of the long-standing colonial capitalist model of development. Furthermore, the symposium delved into the role of class formation within African states, with some panelists discussing the role of Western-oriented African elites in their contributions as well to the causes of the region's underdevelopment in the sense that Walter Rodney used the term, including debt and dependency, by aligning their interests with the interests of imperialist core states and undermining class struggle within the African continent. The discussions also touched on the enduring legacies of Mao on Chinese political culture and economic policies and practices, both at the level of state as well as private investment, as well as historical memories of China's important role in supporting anti-colonial struggles on the African continent, as distinct from the West's own history on the continent of slavery, colonialism, neo-colonial military and economic intervention, and how these distinct histories and memories may inform different types of relations today. So without further ado, I'd like to begin by, I will introduce all of the panelists now, as well as our student moderator, who we're very lucky to have with us, Agnes Chimney, who is a global studies student and is beginning her MA work in international affairs next semester. She was born in Sarajevo and is interested in researching the role of ethnic identity in political participation. Our first panelist today will be Oussama Dhieb, who is a teaching assistant of Chinese civilization at Carthage University. He's a researcher at the Research Laboratory in International Law, International Jurisdictions, and Comparative Constitutional Law, and is a member of the Tunisian Association of Political Science. We also will have with us Carlos Oya, professor of political economy and development at SOAS. Carlos Oya is a development economist by training, and his main research interests are labor relations and employment, economic transformation, agrarian political economy, development policy, poverty, and research methodology. He has worked for several years in government in Mozambique, and where he did extensive field research on rural labor markets and rural poverty. Carlos recently led a project on structural transformations and employment outcomes in infrastructure construction and manufacturing sectors in Ethiopia and Angola, with a specific focus on Chinese firms. We also have Mikaela Erskog with us, who is a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. We also have, unfortunately, Nada Trigi, who was supposed to join us from Tunis with the Tunisian Observatory, with the Observatory for the Tunisian Economy. Unfortunately, she was unable to join us today, but hopefully she'll be able to join us for one of the future lecture series that Ying mentioned earlier. So we will begin with Oussama Dhieb. And sorry, and I also would like to, as we ask Oussama to unmute himself, I also would like to thank Brahim Ruaba, who is our translator, our interpreter today. Thank you so much.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for inviting me to share my point of view about China presence in North Africa, but I'm apologize to speak in Arabic because I feel more comfortable to speak in Arabic. وددت الحديث اليوم عن موضوع أعتبره مهم جدا، وهو مسألة الحضور الصيني في شمال أفريقيا، حيث يمثل محور جدل بين وجهتي نظر كما أشرتي، بين وجهة نظر صينية تعتبر أن هذا الحضور هو حضور مفيد لأفريقيا، ووجهة نظر غربية تعتقد أنه محاولة هيمنة جديدة على أفريقيا.
I would like to speak today about two points of view or two perspectives that are mainly emanate from the global north, one of which paints China-Africa relations as an opportunity to achieve development in Africa, and the second considers this presence to be a form of new conquest for Africa.
بالتالي سيكون هناك طابع إثنومركزي للتحليل في أدوات التحليل، وهو ما سيقود يعني تباعا لنتائج مغلوطة.
While the African point of view remains almost absent, except for some attempts, I would like to try and answer the central question, and that is, to what extent does the Chinese presence in Africa represent an opportunity for partnership? And to do so, I think it's necessary to return to the history of the relations between the two parties.
بداية أود العودة إلى المراحل الأولى للعلاقات الأفريقية الصينية، على اعتبار أن هذا السياق التاريخي هو مهم جدا، مهم من حيث أن أول لقاء بين الصين وأفريقيا كان يندرج في إطار تبادل تجاري ثقافي، حيث كانت هناك الرحلات الأولى للأميرال تشونغ إلى الشرق الأفريقي.
I think it is really important to start with a historical overview for the first sort of points of contact between the African continent and China, and to highlight the fact that these are not new relations, but rather ancient ones. And the initial contacts were for travelers in both directions that had the character, commercial and trade and cultural character.
ثم مرحلة ثانية كانت هناك أيضا زيارة ابن بطوطة للصين، وهي مرحلة الالتقاء الصيني مع الأفريقي مع الصين، وبالتالي أول لقاء بين الصين وأفريقيا وليس سياق استعماري أو سياق هيمنة.
The first contact the first recorded contact that we have is the record of the traveler Ibn Battuta, who set out on his journey from the Islamic West Africa to East Asia and southeastern China. And it is important to highlight the fact that it was in a pre-colonial context.
ثم هناك مرحلة ثانية من العلاقات والتي بدأت مع العصر الحديث، حيث مع تأسيس جمهورية الصين الشعبية كان هناك دعم مستمر لحركات التحرر الوطني في إطار التضامن جنوب ودعم حركات التحرر في إفريقيا.
The second stage of contact between Africa and China began in the sort of modern era, specifically in the period following the founding of the People's Republic of China, where there was continuous Chinese support for liberation movements across Africa, and an emphasis on fighting imperialism and strengthening South-South solidarity.
وكانت هذه الفكرة السياسية الأساسية التي بنيت عليها العقيدة الخارجية الصينية، وهي فكرة مناهضة الهيمنة.
And this anti-imperialist idea was a key component on which Chinese foreign policy was constructed.
أما المرحلة الثالثة فتميزت بتحول من منطق التضامن الأيديولوجي جنوب إلى مرحلة النفعية المتبادلة مع أفريقيا، خصوصا في فترة ما بعد الانفتاح الصيني.
The third stage was characterized by a shift from a logic of purely ideological solidarity to a stage of mutual benefit. And this came especially after the period known as the Chinese opening.
حيث صارت شعارات رابح رابح هي الأكثر حضور في العلاقات بين الصين وأفريقيا، ومثلت هذه المرحلة بداية الخروج الصيني نحو العالمية، واختار الصينيون في هذه المرحلة أفريقيا على اعتبار أنها مخبر، يعني يعتبر مخبر جديد يمكن أن تجرب الصين سياساتها الجديدة في أفريقيا.
This period has been characterized by such slogans as win-win partnerships, and this stage also represents the beginning of the Chinese ascendancy on the global stage, and has also been dominated by a view that Africa could be in some ways a laboratory for new policies.
على اعتبار أنه في عصر الانفتاح الصيني شكلت المناطق التي اعتمدها نظام دeng xiaoping للانفتاح بالمناطق الحرة على السواحل لم تكن تلبي فائض الإنتاج الذي كان موجودا بين الصين، فسعت الصين إلى البحث عن أسواق جديدة خارج المجال الصيني في أفريقيا. Okay.
أسامة I didn't hear ما سمعتش آخر ما قلته كنت تتقطع.
قلت أنه على اعتبار أنه كان هناك نوع من فائض الإنتاج في الصين، سعت الصين إلى البحث عن مناطق أخرى لتلبية الحاجة الاقتصادية والنمو الإنتاج التي تعيشه.
So due to the Chinese model of the development, there was a surplus of production that China had to look for alternative and external outlets for it, and some of those outlets have been these special trade zones. هي مناطق خاصة للتجارة.
ثم المرحلة الرابعة وهي مرحلة مأسسة العلاقات الصينية الإفريقية، والتي أصبحت تعتمد مجموعة من الوسائط كالمنتدى الإفريقي الصيني والمنتدى العربي الصيني.
The fourth stage of African-Chinese relations is a stage of institutionalization of relations, and which is considered also rationalization of historical relations between China and Africa. And this took the form of the Chinese African Forum and the Chinese Arab Forum.
لكن دعنا نرى ما هي أهمية إفريقيا بالنسبة للصين.
Let us see what is the importance of Africa to China.
بداية إفريقيا هي مهمة جدا من الناحية الجيوسياسية، على اعتبار أن هناك مجموعة من الموانئ التي تقع في البحر الأحمر والبحر المتوسط، والتي تسعى الصين إلى تأمين هذه الموانئ من أجل تأمين تجارتها الخارجية، والتي هي بالأساس تجارة بحرية.
Primarily, Africa's importance to China is a geopolitical one. The widespread presence of ports in East Africa and the Mediterranean are of high interest to China to secure its trade routes.
والمسألة الثانية هي مسألة ربط الموانئ بالشركات الحكومية الصينية، وربط أيضا الموانئ بالمستودعات ومصانع الإنتاج.
And the second point is the thinking of linking these ports to state-owned Chinese state-owned enterprises and production warehouses.
أما من زاوية جيو اقتصادية، فتكمن أهمية إفريقيا بالنسبة للصين في أنها تشكل مكان جديد مهم لإمكانية فرض معايير جديدة.
From a geo-economic point of view, Africa is a space, from a Chinese perspective, is a space where new criteria can be tried.
أيضا هناك مجموعة من الأسواق الاقتصادية، على اعتبار إفريقيا قارة فتية جدا وتشهد نمو ديموغرافي سريع جدا، وبالتالي هي مكان لمدن كبرى جديدة وكونغلوميرا جديدة، وبالتالي تشكل مجال مهم لتصدير هذه البضائع الصينية.
The third point of importance is the fact that Africa is a young continent that is demographically with a lot of potential for development and urbanization, and these make it an attractive market space for China.
أما المسألة الثالثة والأخيرة وهي مسألة الطاقة، وهي في السعي لتنويع مصادر الطاقة، على اعتبار أن الشرق الأوسط هو منطقة غير آمنة للطاقة، وهي منطقة تشهد نزاعات، وبالتالي السعي نحو الخروج إلى مناطق أكثر أمانا لتوفير الطاقة.
And the last point has to do with energy, especially given the volatility of the Middle East and the competition, the fierce competition over sources of energy in the Middle East. China is looking elsewhere in places that it deems to be more secure for its energy needs.
طبعا هذه أهمية إفريقيا بالنسبة للصين، لكن الصين أيضا مهمة بالنسبة لإفريقيا.
Well, these are the attractive points for China in Africa, but there are equally attractive points in China for Africa.
وأنا أعتقادي أهم شيء بالنسبة لإفريقيا هو تطوير البنية التحتية، وهذا ما استفادت منه أماكن كثيرة مثل أنغولا، مثل إثيوبيا، ومثل عديد البلدان كالجزائر ومصر.
And the main area of interest for Africa has been the development of infrastructures, and various African countries or states have benefited from infrastructural projects, including Angola, Ethiopia, Algeria, and Egypt.
وهي جزء مهم جدا في السياسة الصينية في صناعة الصورة وصناعة سردية أخرى للصين.
And this has been really key for China in sort of rebranding or constructing a new narrative about China and Chinese role in Africa.
فبحسب استطلاع لأفريكان بارومتر تعتبر البنية التحتية أهم عامل يعني يساعد في تكوين صورة إيجابية للصين.
According to a survey by the African Barometer, the development of infrastructure is the most important.
هذه صورة أخذتها من أحد المدن في تونس، وهي تمثل جمهور كرة قدم، وهو أمام مقر السيادي بلدية صفاقس مدينة في تونس، وهم يطالبون باللغة الصينية بأن تبني الصين ملعبا اقتداء بالملاعب التي تشاهدها في العالم. وهذا يعني أن هذه المشاريع تحت البنية التحتية هي مهمة جدا بالنسبة لصناعة الصورة للصين.
This is a photo taken in Sfax, a southern Tunisian, coastal Tunisian city of soccer fans protesting in front of a government building in Chinese, requesting that China helps build a football stadium with international standards. And this is one of one example that highlights how important these infrastructural projects are for the Chinese image.
اعتقادي أن هذه النقطة مهمة جدا، وهي تمثل فارقة بين السياسات الأمريكية في إفريقيا والسياسات الصينية في إفريقيا. إن السياسات الأمريكية في إفريقيا هي تعتمد بالأساس على مقاربة من الفوق إلى الأسفل، بدعم الجمعيات، بدعم المجتمع المدني، بمحاولة نشر بعض المعايير من خلال المجتمع المدني. أما المقاربة الصينية فهي مقاربة مختلفة، وهي مقاربة من الأسفل إلى الأعلى، والتي ترمي لصناعة الصورة من خلال الطبقات الأكثر شعبية.
And these infrastructural projects are for me what distinguishes the role or the interventions that China has on the continent from those of the United States, for example, where the United States intervenes through NGOs and the imposition of certain values in a top-down sort of manner. China, on the other hand, intervenes through these infrastructural projects that touch or change the lives of the working classes.
وما يفسر من ناحية أخرى أن معظم الأفارقة في حسب استطلاع أفريكان بارومتر يعتبرون أن مثال التنمية أو نموذج التنمية الصيني هو الأفضل بالمقارنة ببقية النماذج يعني القوى الاستعمارية القديمة كبريطانيا وفرنسا.
And according
أو حتى مثل هذه مجموعة من الصور لبعض المشاريع البنية التحتية الصينية التي حققتها في أفريقيا، يعني وهي مشاريع مهمة جدا في صناعة الصورة. تقريبا 10,000 كيلومتر من السكك الحديدية، 10,000 كيلومتر من الطرقات وتوليد الطاقة والمؤسسات التعليمية، مؤسسة كونفوشيوس وإلى غير ذلك. لكن رغم ذلك أنا أقول أن هناك مجموعة من النقائص في بناء هذه الشراكة الصينية الأفريقية، وأعتبر أن هناك خلل رئيسي في هذه الشراكة.
Despite the aforementioned benefits to this relationship between Africa and China, I still consider that there's an imbalance and a central one at that.
بداية أن معظم المشاريع الصينية في تونس في بلدان شمال أفريقيا أو حتى في أفريقيا هي لا تشكل استثمارات، أي لا تشكل يعني استثمارات خارجية مباشرة، بل هي تعتمد على ميزانية الدولة وتعتمد على صفقات عمومية.
First of all these infrastructural projects in Africa, they're not reliant on foreign direct investment, but rather on local budgeting and public contracts.
ثانيا أن إسهام الشركات الصينية على مستوى نقل التكنولوجيا هو إسهام ضعيف جدا ويكاد يكون معدوم على مستوى بلدان مثل تونس والجزائر والمغرب.
The second point is that the transfer of technology is very weak from China to North African countries, for example.
رابعا أن القدرة التشغيلية للشركات الصينية هي قدرة غير متوافقة مع سوق طبيعة اليد العاملة المتاحة، بمعنى أن اليد العاملة المغاربية مثلا هي يد عاملة مختصة، وهي يد عاملة تحمل الأستاذية ومتحصلة على مستوى دراسي عالي، بينما ما تطرحه من هذه الشركات الصينية من فرص تشغيل هي فرص ضعيفة جدا وغير متلائمة مع أصحاب هذه الشهادات، بل تستهدف الطبقات الدنيا من المجتمع.
The third point is that the needs of these in terms of labor, the needs of these projects do not meet the needs of the work market in North Africa, where you have a highly skilled and specialized workforce, but at the same time, these projects are only provide only low skilled jobs.
المسألة الأخرى أن معظم فرص التشغيل التي تطرحها الشركات الصينية هي تطرح أجور زهيدة جدا ولا تساهم في تنمية حقيقية بالنسبة لليد العاملة.
And consequently, the low-skilled jobs are very badly paid, which leads them to question the utility of these jobs to economic development.
والمسألة الثالثة أن دور الشركات الحكومية الصينية هو دور يعني في كثير من الأحيان إذا استثنينا مشاريع البنية التحتية يعد دور غير إيجابي في الاقتصاد الوطني المحلي بالنسبة لهذه البلدان، على اعتبار أن هذه الشركات يعني تجعل من مهمة الشركات المتوسطة والصغرى في هذه البلدان مهمة صعبة جدا، باعتبار عدم قدرتها على التنافس، وأن معظم المشاريع التي تستحوذ عليها هذه الشركات الحكومية الصينية تعطيها بالوكالة إلى شركات أخرى صينية، وتحرم من المؤسسات المحلية من المنافسة.
As a consequence, apart from the infrastructural projects realized by Chinese public or state-owned companies, there's also the negative impact that this involvement has on local small and medium-sized enterprises, in the sense that they're unable to compete when these large state-owned Chinese state-owned conglomerates take on these infrastructural projects. All the outsourcing is done to smaller and medium-sized Chinese companies and not to local companies, and this puts local and small and medium-sized enterprises out of business and makes them unable to compete.
أنا أعتقد على أهمية فكرة شراكة رابح التي تطرحها الصين، وعلى أهمية يعني no string approach التي تطرحها الصين. فإن مسألة الاقتصاد الصيني المندمج في إفريقيا الذي يعتمد على شركات حكومية كبرى مع في شراكته مع هذه المؤسسات المحلية، يعني هناك اختلال واضح. مثلا أعطيك مثال: الصفقات التي يعني المشاريع البنية التحتية التي مولتها الصين في الجزائر أو في تونس، هي بالأساس هي مشاريع صينية تعتمد على صفقات عمومية وتعتمد على أموال عمومية، وهذه المشاريع تكون بيد عاملة صينية، وهذه المشاريع تمول من بنوك صينية، وهذه المشاريع تحول الأموال للعملة إلى بنوك صينية. وبالتالي فإن الحلقة الاقتصادية في هذا كله هي حلقة صينية صرفة، والاستفادة الإفريقية من هذه المشاريع تكاد تكون شبه منعدمة إلا في حالتها النهائية، أي حالة الاستهلاك المشاريع، وبالتالي تقصي الأفارقة من التنمية الحقيقية.
There are numerous examples of infrastructural projects in Algeria and Tunisia in which the realization is done by Chinese state-owned enterprises and the financing from Chinese banks in an integrated sort of benefit of these Chinese companies, where the added value for locals is almost inexistent. And the only way that they are integrated into this cycle is by being consumers of the final product.
شكرا جزيلا، شكرا لكم على الاستماع.
Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation, Oussama. And you raised some really great points about the perceptions. I'm really glad that you brought in the some statistics from the beginning of perceptions of African citizens in regards to Chinese investment and openness, especially at the level of infrastructural investment and investment in infrastructure projects, but also thinking about some of the limitations, in particular in relation to investing in sectors that could meet the needs and sort of aspirations of highly skilled, educated populations, the potential impact for small and medium-sized businesses, in particular in North Africa, and thinking about this question of low value added production. So the investments in sectors that are low value added in terms of global supply chains, and perhaps therefore not as helpful as promised in terms of, or as many people hope for in terms of contributing to economic development. So thank you for that. Some really important critical themes that you've raised. Next, we will move on to our second speaker, Carlos Oya, a professor of political economy of development at SOAS. And Carlos, I know you joined us a little bit late, but I did read out your full bio earlier. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Does this sound okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be in this panel, and I'm very fond of the New School for Social Research for many years, so I'm glad to contribute to these debates. I have some slides which I'll try to. Oh, I can't share my screen.
Okay, we're gonna give
you should be able to now.
Yes, now I can. Yeah, thank you. So the topic of my presentation is, global China. I use the concept of global China, and I relate it to Africa's industrialization aspirations. Just to give a bit of a very brief background, I've done research on these issues, particularly focused on employment outcomes in two particular countries where Chinese presence, specifically the presence of Chinese firms, has been very, very significant. That is Ethiopia and Angola, two countries that are quite different in many respects, and therefore a lot of our analysis was precisely based on the variation of outcomes and practices and dynamics. But I come from, I'm more of an African studies person, and we got into this topic by basically witnessing the substantial increase in engagement of different Chinese actors in different African countries, and particularly Chinese enterprises and Chinese agencies providing finance for infrastructure in particular. So now I'm working on this project of bringing together the evidence that we collected from 4 years of research in Ethiopia and Angola, including quite a lot of desk research. We conducted large-scale surveys of workers and firms in both countries in two sectors, manufacturing and construction. These two sectors are those where you see a greater number of enterprises operating, from small, medium enterprises to sort of larger scale enterprises. And just as a background before getting into the kinds of contributions and why people have been paying attention to this topic and why it matters for the industrialization aspirations of African countries, and here I'm referring primarily to sub-Saharan African countries where there has been very limited industrialization. I would like to just give a bit of some premises. There are different interpretations of the industrial experience and the lack of industrial experience in most of sub-Saharan African countries. There are those who have argued that whatever limited industrialization that we've seen after independence is something that we could call premature industrialization, i.e. countries that actually attempted to industrialize before they had the basic conditions to achieve sustainable industrialization, i.e. Low levels of education, very limited electricity access and generation, and very low levels of savings. There are those who have emphasized the opposite. After the initial attempts to industrialize in the 1960s and 70s, some countries did make some of these attempts, and there were some interesting stories of industrialization, like in the case of Zambia. They talk about premature deindustrialization, i.e. with the Washington Consensus policies and structural adjustment, the openness of trade policies basically led to a substantial deterioration of the industrial record, industrial performance, and the shutting down of multiple factories across the board. Interesting, imports of consumer goods from China did contribute to this process of deindustrialization, but that was primarily facilitated by the changes in policies and the liberalization of trade in most of the sub-Saharan African continent. In more recent times, where there has been some efforts to sort of resume industrialization in some countries, some people would talk about thin industrialization, i.e. we see some success, but primarily at the lower end of specific tasks within global production networks. So the apparel sector, textile and apparel sector, are a good example of that. But we know from history of capitalism that textile and apparel have always been the sort of initial stages of any industrialization effort. So it's not necessarily that surprising. And then there's the idea of contingent industrialization, which is necessary in order to make sense of the huge variation that exists actually both across countries and over time. So there have been different attempts, many of which have not been sufficiently sustained, but also not a shortage of success stories that would need to be highlighted. In terms of the sort of aggregate picture, obviously, a lot of people would tend to show that, you know, in terms of percentage, the proportion of manufacturing and total GDP hasn't been really going up. So this is why people talk about the lack of industrialization of Africa. But interestingly, in the last sort of 2 decades or so, what you see is, in real terms, a quite substantial growth of manufacturing output, but in a context of the commodity boom, where, you know, natural resource production was actually, you know, growing even faster than manufacturing production. But there's clearly a revival of manufacturing, particularly light manufacturing, in a growing number of countries. And partly this is because some of those basic conditions that I was referring to before, i.e. levels of literacy, access to electricity, etc., have substantially also improved over the past 3-4 decades. Now, in countries like Ethiopia, this has been particularly remarkable. Ethiopia, before the crisis, the pandemic, and the war, was hailed as one of the success stories in terms of attempts to industrialize. And what we found is that these sort of process of industrialization, which really began more seriously in 2012, from 2012 to 13 onwards, was very much driven by foreign direct investments into the industrial parks that had been established primarily by the government of Ethiopia, trying to attract suppliers within different global value chains, but particularly textile and apparel, into the country. And interestingly, this is where you can see Chinese firms featuring quite prominently. And in fact, Ethiopia is a good case study to show how Chinese enterprises have substantially contributed to the generation of new manufacturing jobs. You know, of course, manufacturing jobs in the apparel sector, therefore with the conditions that you find in these global production networks. These are jobs that are characterized by relatively low wages, and this is the reality of the labor market in Ethiopia, and therefore trying to compete with the likes of Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, or Madagascar. So there has been quite a lot of dynamism going on in the last 10 years or so, 10, 15 years. And Ethiopia is not the only country, but clearly Ethiopia is one of the most relevant countries. By contrast, in Angola, this didn't happen. There has been some industrialization, but in very different sectors, primarily driven by the infrastructure construction boom. So interestingly, it is the building materials sector that has substantially grown over the past 10, 15 years. But that is a very different kind of sector that doesn't create the number of jobs that light manufacturing will tend to create, and that is far more sort of capital intensive and dependent on foreign technology. So in a nutshell, when we think about in what ways this global China, and by global China, it is a sort of broad concept that tries to encapsulate this growing engagement of different actors from China overseas, whether it's through finance, investments, trade, etc. It is a sort of an amalgam of different vectors of increasing economic relations between China and the rest of the world. So clearly, Sub-Saharan Africa has been a significant destination of these different vectors of relationships, certainly not to the level of Southeast Asia, for example. So we need to sort of keep things in perspective, but equally, or perhaps even more importantly, than Latin America. And if we think about, okay, what have been the key vectors that may have theoretically, but also in practice, contributed to these new attempts to industrialize, and as in the case of Ethiopia or Kenya and other such countries, I've identified essentially 5 different vectors, and they're all in different ways interrelated. One that is absolutely essential has been the finance for economic infrastructure. And it's not just the finance, but as has been said in the previous presentation, also the direct building of Chinese economic infrastructure. Chinese contractor companies, essentially state-owned enterprises, have become major players in the context of infrastructure building, primarily roads, ports, railways, power generation infrastructure like dams, electricity generation, and so on, and industrial parks, of course, as well, very big. And now they've come to control pretty much 50 to 60% of the total infrastructure market at an aggregate level. In some countries, they represent even more than that. It could be 70 to even 80% of the value of all the infrastructure, economic infrastructure projects. So we know from Hirschman and many others that there's no way you can industrialize if you don't set the basic foundations. And one of the basic foundations, if you talk to any manufacturing investor in the textile and apparel sector, is the access, the reliability, and the cost of electricity. That will trump everything else. So even if you have the lowest wage cost you can imagine, you're not going to have a factory, a textile and apparel factory, exporting to Europe and the United States if you don't have cheap and reliable electricity. And that is precisely one of the conditions that were met in Ethiopia, and which is very difficult to find in other African countries. The second key element is foreign direct investment and the growing presence of private industrial investors. And I stress this, primarily, most Chinese enterprises in the manufacturing sector are private enterprises, as opposed to the state-owned corporations, which dominate the infrastructure building sector. So FDI has been increasing quite fast, clearly not as fast as in Southeast Asia, but in some countries has been remarkable. And that previous chart was a manifestation, a reflection of that in the case of Ethiopia. Of course, because many of these enterprises invest in light manufacturing sectors, as in the case of Ethiopia, these tend to be labor-intensive activities, and therefore quite a substantial number of jobs have been created in these sectors. So one thing that really is creating a space for substantial change is the gradual building or contribution towards the building of an emerging industrial workforce, which was pretty much non-existent 15, 20 years ago, certainly in the case of Ethiopia. So we're talking new jobs that might be low paid or not very well paid, but certainly not worse paid than other jobs. This is one of the findings of our research. The wages are actually comparable across different firms of different origins. So new jobs with new skills, and basically, by and large, in the case of Ethiopia, up to 70 to 80% of the workers in these textile and apparel firms were people who were coming from rural areas. And for them, this was the first non-agricultural job that they got. So there's a whole process of a new dynamic of internal migration towards industrial parks that is quite remarkable, has been quite remarkable, especially before the war. All that comes with access to suitable and affordable technology. Interestingly, although it is true that the spillover effects and the linkages with local companies are still relatively limited and weak, that is indeed one of the biggest challenges that most firms are facing. By the way, it's not just Chinese firms. If you talk to any other foreign firm, Turkish, Indian, etc., they really struggle to generate these linkages with local firms because of the weakness and of the supply chains in countries like Ethiopia. But it is quite clear that you can see emerging firms, local firms, that are now using affordable technology in the form of Chinese-made capital equipment and machinery for some basic activities with relatively low barriers to entry. So there is also some element of change there. And then there is indeed the availability of patient capital finance for manufacturing investment. This was not really available before, and it's the first time that we see now manufacturing firms getting some access to finance that is not short-term and therefore generates more possibilities for taking some risk investments. Let's not forget that for any manufacturing firm, investing in African countries is pretty much a new thing, and it's typically taken in terms of high risk perception. But once they invest, actually they seem to be quite resilient. Ethiopia is a good case of that. Although many firms have left, but what is actually more striking is how many firms have actually stayed, despite the fact that Ethiopia has been going through one of the worst civil wars that we've seen in recent times in Africa. Now, let me just finish with highlighting what I think have been some of the most effective vectors up to now. So one basic condition is that industrialization takeoff, in the case of Ethiopia is a good example of that, is certainly not possible without substantial and targeted infrastructure development. The examples of railway investments, roads, and dams, in addition to industrial parks, are a very good example. And that was not driven by Chinese, by the way, that was driven by the Ethiopian state. The Ethiopian state actually had a very active and bold and coherent industrial policy pretty much since 2010. And what they did was leveraging on the patient finance provided by 2 or 3 key Chinese finance institutions to finance these investments at a time where other sources of finance, notably the World Bank, were quite reluctant to take all these risks. Interestingly, once these started to flow, even institutions like the World Bank became slightly more interested, and they started, for example, contributing some finance to the building of some of these industrial parks. But that was not possible. That was only possible because of this industrial policy. So we had lower electricity costs, better transport and logistics, which leads to lower transport costs. This is a major bottleneck, a major constraint in most manufacturing investments in many African countries, and dedicated industrial hubs, which ensure agglomeration economies. I've already mentioned patient finance and with flexibility. I know that there is a lot of debate now about debt distress and the extent to which there is some kind of debt trap diplomacy. The reality is that most of the countries in most serious situation of debt distress are in debt distress because of the debt they got through financial markets, through Eurobond emissions, for example, and so on, not so much as with debt incurred with China. Only 2 or 3 countries have been really struggling with repaying loans to a large, in terms of large scale, to Chinese finance institutions. And then the last 2 points relate to the business of exporting industrial capacity and trying to figure out why is it that Chinese manufacturing firms are investing in Africa. That requires an understanding of what are the key push and pull factors. I've talked a lot about pull factors in a country like Ethiopia, but also we need to think about what is driving these textile and apparel firms and some other firms that produce very basic manufacturing goods, consumer goods, to move out of China and invest in these other countries. Of course, many have gone to Southeast Asia, but increasingly they're taking the risk to penetrate African markets. So that requires an understanding of the process of rebalancing and change that is happening within the manufacturing sector in China, and the fact that, as Justin Lin has recently said, that this is perhaps a little bit hyperbolic, but he claims that up to 85 million manufacturing jobs are up for grabs. Now, whether African countries will attract these jobs or it will be India or Southeast Asian countries, that really is the key question. Now, the final point refers to African agency, and perhaps the contrast that we drew between Ethiopia and Angola is a perfect example of how central domestic agency is and how central the coherence, consistency, and viability of industrial policies are to generate these kinds of outcomes. So you might have all the Chinese finance you want, you might have all the interest from Chinese private investors that you might want, but this is not going to happen unless there is a solid, coherent industrial policy framework in place that generates the conditions for these investments to be viable. That is the bottom line. So that when you draw a contrast between, for example, Chinese manufacturing investors in Ethiopia and those in Nigeria, we realize that the only ones that are able to be in the business of exporting to global production networks are the ones who set up business in Ethiopia. And that was because of the kind of industrial policy that was established in Ethiopia. Whereas in Nigeria, essentially, what these manufacturing investors are trying to do is to take advantage of the domestic market. It's a kind of classic import substitution, industrialization type of investment. But that is not because of some kind of coherent and bold industrial policy. It's because of the kind of market opportunities that individual entrepreneurs are finding in large markets like Nigeria. So the question really is, what are the drivers and what really is conducive to an ambitious and coherent industrial policy framework? And in order to answer that question, you have to understand politics of production, the politics of the place, understand whether there are conducive political settlements and the kinds of balance of power that generates a condition for that sort of industrial policy to emerge, to be sustained, and to be implemented. It's not just to have a nice paper and a nice report, but also is having the institutions, the coordination, all the agencies that are there to implement things like industrial parks, railway, the logistics of exporting goods to other regions of the world in a context where you are, for example, a landlocked country like Ethiopia. So you basically have are facing lots of different challenges. So in our research and what I'm writing at the moment, I'm trying to basically expand on each of these 4 elements and make sense of the key contrasts that exist between different countries in order to overcome the African essentialism that is so often biasing the kind of analysis that we find on, the kind of narratives, both academic but also media narrative about Africa-China relations. And I stop there because I know I'm a little bit over the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really enlightening presentation, Carlos. And did a great job, not just of sort of challenging the hegemonic narratives on China, but also on African states as well, the essentialism, as you pointed out, and talking about these key channels of global China's contribution to African industrialization efforts with the example of Ethiopia, and thinking about, excuse me, the most effective vectors and the focus on infrastructure, which we also heard from Oussama as well, and I'm sure we'll hear from more in Mikaela's discussion. But I think it's a really important point that you made, and this is something that came across in our last panel too, about the importance of agency and African agency in terms of being able to leverage investments, and how crucial it is to have a solid industrial policy and institutions, as well as conducive sort of balance of forces, as you pointed out, to make sure that these investments are viable and contribute to development. So excellent. Thank you so much for that. Next, we will be moving on to Mikaela Erskog from the Tricontinental Institute of Research. Thank you, Mikaela. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you. I'm super honored to be part of this conference and on this panel. I've learned a lot already. I'm a historian and a political activist, so a lot of these different economic and political interventions that have been made are incredibly important. So thank you for that. And I greet you guys. I'm in Shanghai right now, so if I get a little bit coherent, please forgive me. It's 1:30 a.m. and I didn't quite figure out the time difference, daylight savings. But I am gonna talk about, and I'm really glad that I had the confidence in the panel that the panel will speak, and has already spoken earlier, a lot about the details of China-Africa relations. So I'm gonna do a little bit of a different angle where I'm gonna look at the situation from a more global geopolitical stance, because I basically, part of my work is I'm a social researcher in Tricontinental, and we basically serve our movements. We are connected to a range of grassroots movements, from left political parties to trade unions. My political direction comes from NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, which has about over 200,000 members. And so part of my work in China right now is, one, how can Africans better understand China's modernization, China's development? And two, how can China understand what's happening in Africa at the grassroots level, not just the, the FM's, foreign ministries' interactions with state organizers. So I'm going to focus a lot on a project that we'll be publishing our first paper in January next year, looking at basically what Xi Jinping said at his meeting with Vladimir Putin: change is not seen in 100 years. That we're in a particular moment that Africans need to pay attention to, that we're seeing changes not seen in 100 years. So that will be the main focus of my presentation. But before I do that, I did want to share that one of the elements to China-Africa, and Comrade Eric Olander already mentioned this, that there is a low China literacy rate in Africa. We don't understand China sufficiently. On the other hand, China has improved its literacy of the African continent and the global south in general, but still, of course, has certain limitations, which I greet you today. Only 24 hours ago, Henry Kissinger, the war criminal, extraordinaire, died just yesterday. And it was so interesting because, China, they have very nice things to say about Henry Kissinger because of the role he played in reestablishing and normalizing relationships between the US and China. But what they miss in China is the extraordinary level of violence that he's wrought across the global south. And that is something that I think China needs to think about, is how does the global south perceive these kinds of figures? We know they have to balance political relationships, international foreign relationships, but even MSNBC, all these kind of right-wing conservative news sites said, well, Kissinger died and he did a lot of fucked up things. He killed millions and orchestrated millions of horrible things, including, and we write about this at Tricontinental because it's the 50-year anniversary of the coup in Chile, is that the coup in Chile was not just a coup against the Chilean people, but it was a coup against the Third World Project. Because what Allende was proposing was a different type of socialist development. So I think that's something that we continue to try to debate and socialize new information with our Chinese colleagues and comrades. But I will say, before I get into my presentation, that I do think of all the regions of the world, China has the strongest political sentimentality around Africa. All the Chinese youth I speak to, at some point in their education, was taught something about Africa. Whether or not they know that much, they still know Africa. I've been in rural parts of China, in Yunnan, in Jiangxi province, and when I say, 我是南非人, like I'm South African, they're like, oh, I know where that is, and oh, that's so interesting. There's a sentiment, and I think this sentiment isn't just simply about, as I think it was Eric said, which I thought was actually, I follow Eric's work very closely, and I thought it was very interesting that he said, actually economically, there is a decline in some areas in terms of investment, trade, etc. And in terms of proportion, Africa is insignificant to China's overall global trade. But what he said that was interesting is that there's a political project that's happening that is extremely important. And what I wanted to raise, and I thank Oussama for giving us a bit of the history of China-Africa relations, is that there is a political project that still remains, even if it's not fully formed, still remains extremely relevant. People all talk about Zhou Enlai going in 1964-65 to Africa as his first trip. All Chinese people know about TAZARA, the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, which was built at a time when China could barely build its own massive infrastructural projects of the kind. It's not a mistake that Xi Jinping's father was part of the publications department that published the first translation of Nkrumah's selected works. That is something that we can't miss. The Bandung spirit of 1955 was called the Afro-Asian Solidarity. And so there is this historical relationship that we need to revive, and we need to emphasize this closeness that not only stems from the fact that we have shared histories around colonialism. China had 100 years of humiliation. In Africa, we've had 500 to 600 years of humiliation at the hands of the European colonialists. But it is something that isn't popularized and understood by a lot of young Africans and the Chinese society at large. Then the other thing that I'm surprised nobody mentioned it is when in 2020, China publicized that it had alleviated extreme poverty, that 250 million people had been lifted themselves out of extreme poverty. That is of huge significance, but it was not a talking point in any South African media, African media, despite the fact that that is, the biggest scourge of our society is poverty. And so let me pull up my share screen. Sorry, let me pull up my presentation. There we go. Sorry. You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Sorry, it's the one where I have to customize it. There we go. So what I want to focus on, and I think it was Comrade Barry said it, we're in a moment in which, and the work I do largely when I talk to African leaders of NUMSA, of the Socialist Party in Zambia, of the socialist movement in Ghana, is we're trying to get folks to understand that we're in a particular moment in which Africa really needs to evaluate who really are the friends and who really are the enemies, who is really advancing the cause of humanity and who is not. And I know this is kind of deviating, but this is part of how we're trying to build a counter-hegemonic understanding of not only what China is, but what are the geopolitical implications of the rising China and how it relates to Africa. The questions that basically, are part of my work is, what is China really? What can we learn from China? Not so we can import a kind of one size fits all, but to think about what the priorities of their society was. And how did China, for me, this is the most interesting thing, is how did China modernize in 70 years without the violence, theft, and conquest that characterizes the rise of all other leading economies in the West? I mean, maybe you guys are familiar with Oussama Dhieb. She has this great study on colonial theft, and 45 trillion in the span of, I can't remember the actual years, but in the span of quite a relatively short amount of time was what the UK was able to get from their exploitation of Indian society and Indian people. The second is, and I'm just going to mention this briefly before I get into my more geopolitical framing that is part of the work I'm currently involved in, is that at Tricontinental, we've been trying to make a big effort, because we speak to movements. We try to be as rigorous intellectually as we can, but we're also trying to make things more popular and more accessible to movement leaders. And some of the things we've done is looking at how China dealt with the corona shock or the coronavirus, and how deaths were minimized, how there was a prioritization of people over profits. We also are trying to explain the eradication of extreme poverty and what was done in the process, because I feel like there's a total lack of creativity and interest in trying to understand how do they do it, because we want to do that in the African continent. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of facts that are always part of the work when I'm talking to African leaders and African movement people, is to highlight the fact that 850 million were lifted out of poverty, extreme poverty, that is. The fact that life expectancy rose from 77.9 to 78.2 between 2020 and 21, whilst the US dropped. And I don't have the figure with me, but this was also in relation to the projected. It was projected that the US was going to have, much higher life expectancy, and it actually, I think it was by 5 years or so that it was much lower than expected when it was projected about 10 years ago. And for context, China's life expectancy in 1949, or actually 1950 to be more accurate, was 35 years. And in the span of, and I want to make two distinctions, is by 78, they had increased life expectancy by 32. And then that in turn was increased, as you can see, by 2021 to 78.2. And the reason I raise that is because I've heard that the new school has leftist tendencies. So part of the mistake in the left is that everyone thinks that after the opening up, that's when the real increase in the standard of living happened. But a lot of work was done in the span of 49 to 78 to improve the livelihood of ordinary people. And then, of course, as many of you know, that China's economy has seen huge amounts of growth. And it should be a priority for us to understand what that is and not get stuck in this conversation about, did they stop being socialist? Are they now market capitalist? The real question is, how did they do it? And how has people's standard of living improved? One of the things I was speaking to a Moroccan colleague who visited a few months ago, and we were just shocked. We went to Dali in Yunnan province, and we were just shocked about how many elderly women, like retired women, can enjoy domestic tourism. You don't see that on the African continent. 60-year-old women going to a different part of their country, having, cycling around Erhai Lake, enjoying their lives. I'm sure those of you, who's been to China? Carlos, have you been to China? Nod your head or no? Yeah. When you go to the parks in the weekend and you see elderly people, like hundreds of elderly people singing collective songs together, and not just any songs that are both popular, but songs that come from the historical revolutionary period. I was walking with a group of people, of Africans in Yunnan province on a Saturday, and they saw that they were a group of Africans, and they said, oh, let's make a performance just for these people. And they were, you know, some people had brass instruments, etc. And they played 3 songs, which I think is kind of, it's an anecdote, but it's kind of tells you a bit of the texture and the consciousness of Chinese people. First, they sang or played a version of Jingle Bells. So when they see a foreigner, they're like, foreigners, no Christmas, Jingle Bells it is. The second song they played, which I think also shows the limitation of their consciousness, the average regular Joe's consciousness about who is a foreigner, is that they played Yankee Doodle. Yankee Doodle went to town, because the foreign is the American, sadly. And this is a consequence of the opening up period and the emphasis that was pushed there. But the third song that they played for us was the International, which is, you know, the communist anthem of internationalism and solidarity. And so I think this is a very interesting moment for us to be intervening in China and for us to be developing with China different conceptions and counter-hegemonic narratives, because people are genuinely interested from the grassroots level to the most senior people. So now I'm going to delve into the other part of my section, and apologies that we're all going slightly over time, but I think with Nada not being here, we're slightly allowed. So thank you for that. Right now, particularly in the left in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, there's a real underestimation of what exactly is the, as we call it, the balance of forces. And one of them, one of my colleagues, Gisela Cernadas, along with John Bellamy Foster of Monthly Review, recently published a study where they adjusted the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research. They release these budgets each year. And they basically said the 2022 budget, military budget of the US is about, they claim it's around 800,000. And they adjusted the numbers using the Bureau for Economic Analysis, as well as different national accounts. And what they found is that the US the actual true military spending is at least 1.537 trillion US dollars. That is almost double what is actually spent. And if you think about the fact that the rest of NATO spends around 306 billion, and non-NATO but European US allied people, which, by the way, the study is coming out in January, so you'll see all the qualifiers of who we consider to be in the global north. There are 49 countries we believe to be in the global north, and we think it's a bloc. One of the earlier speakers said that the global south bloc, we don't think that the global south is a bloc yet. They don't act in a collective interest, but the global north acts as a bloc and act advancing particularly the US's interests. But this is an important point, because when we're trying to assess who are friends and who are enemies, and who Africa needs to think about who their friends and enemies are, it's important to understand that the US-led military bloc is essentially 74% of global spending, which is around 2.8 trillion US dollars. You're talking about, I think it was Saud said earlier, that there's 2 trillion of illicit financial flows, money that escapes the continent. But then we also have this priority of our historic partners in the West who prioritize military spending over social spending, which is the complete inverse in China. And I raise this because, just for context, this is the difference. If China is next, the US is vastly ahead in terms of military spending. And just as a small thing, I'm from Zimbabwe, but my father is from Sweden. So I take a personal gripe with the Stockholm Institute that they publish these numbers, because one of the things that they do, for example, is that they don't include the veterans budget of the US in their military spending, but they include the Chinese one. And I still don't quite understand why that's the case. If you guys have the answers, please let me know. But there is also this asymmetry and imbalance in how we report on China versus the US. Then just, this is only of global north countries, the actual military spending per capita, how many times it is above the global average. So if the global average is 0, the US spends 12.6 times higher than the global average, whilst China is at 0.6. That's more than 21 times difference. And I think that's important, because that helps Africans understand, what does the US prioritize? What does Israel, Norway, Australia, UK, what do they prioritize versus what China prioritizes? And that's more into social spending. Then I wanted to share this because one of the questions we were asked is around the comparison between military and China, US military and China military. And I wanted to share this because I'll show you the global bases of the US, but the global North's military deployments last year alone, and this is the UK, France, all of the usual characters, as you can see from the map, these are the countries that deployed, and I'm not counting, I won't say the UN joint missions, because then China does have in Sudan, but of their own accord, these are the, as you can see, mostly the West, Japan, the stooge of the West, as well as Australia and New Zealand, who deployed by country. 409 deployments were made last year alone. And they went to these countries. And as you can see, it's concentrated in the Sahel, it's concentrated in the belt and the region that is also closest to China, that is also part of this Eurasian encirclement that the US is trying to thump on. And based on the World Beyond War calculations of military bases, as you can see, I find it so interesting that the US has 902 military bases outside. And we have this constant debate amongst us that it doesn't matter the number of bases you have. Once you have one US base, you have to an extent ceded some level of sovereignty to the US. One of the examples that isn't counted here, but we are trying to figure out a way to make it more qualitative, is the fact that the US uses the Kotoka International Airport. Michael, I think he might be from Ghana, you said?
Yes.
Michael's from Ghana? Okay. It's that Ghana, in all but name, has given the Terminal 1 is used by the US military based on a 2018 deal. And so they're able to get a direct flight for AFRICOM from Germany, from Stuttgart, goes directly to Ghana, and then can, help to coordinate the various AFRICOM military operations. But I like this image because it shows you that this is what we used to call it in the national liberation times, this is the kind of independent zones or free zones. And that is extremely important because I remember there's somebody who asked the question, why is the US Blinken going on about debt trap, even though it's not the case? And I think Comrade Orlando was being a little bit too generous, that he mentioned that it's a difference between, there are middle-level people who don't necessarily influence the Anthony Blinkens. I think it's for a more specific reason, is right now the military, which Wallerstein spoke about, is war is a concentration of politics by other means, something along those lines, is that right now, and I want to go to the next slide, is that the US is having a serious economic crisis. They're currently, the US average annual GDP growth rate has slowly been declining since the 50s. And the projected is that by, this is the IMF projections, there'll be 1.8% growth. Whilst China, on the other hand, is seeing immense levels of growth and it's only 2.8 last year, right? If I'm not mistaken, but still is seeing more positive growth and is seeing a maintenance of growth. Then the other aspect is that, and I'm sorry, I'm going super fast through this because I just want to make the points, but is that since the 70s, net fixed capital formation, so their ability to generate capital and then invest in their domestic economy, has been rapidly declining, the US, that is, whilst China has been relatively stable. And the reason you need, of course, capital investment is because then it increases the performance of your economy. Then also, I'm just mentioning it quickly, is that the percentage of world industry in terms of value added in GDP, PPP terms, is that China has surpassed the US in many ways. If we look at, and I know people were giving BRICS a hard time, but I still think that there's an objective material basis for us to think about BRICS, is that BRICS 11 now accounts for 38.4% of world industry. And yes, there's still capital flight. Those are still issues we have to deal with. But in objective terms, the leading economies, the G7, have been in relative decline. And therefore, it's important, and this is why I have this last slide, is that, let me go one back. The same map I use of this zone, this free zone, this liberated zone, actually, is the way Amilcar Cabral put it, that is free from US bases, is the region that has had the highest average annual growth rates per capita in the last 10 years. It's China, it's Asia. Sadly, as you can see, South Africa, Nigeria, we're not seeing the same kind of, we're seeing negative growth rates. But comparatively, the US 1.5 average growth rate in per capita terms, whilst China 5.8%, vastly surpassing the US. And so the fact that Anthony Blinken chooses to punt the death narrative, for me, is a more explicit political project. They're trying to delegitimate China because they see China as the economic threat who is displacing the US in GDP, PPP terms, and is performing an important leadership in the global South, which is the last two slides I'll end on, is in economic terms, so these are three intersecting groupings. It's the BRICS 11, the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter, and the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. We raise these because BRICS has to do a little bit with more of the economic development. Group of Friends has to do with those who want to challenge the situation in the UN, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has to do with certain security needs. But that includes mostly Middle Eastern countries. And we thought it was interesting to bring these together and see who lies where and what overlaps, because China is showing, even if it's just a political aspiration, even if it doesn't have the necessary and needed economic basis, because we know, for example, the BRICS's new development bank, they've approved millions of projects or financing for various projects, but none of them have actually taken flight. So we know that some things are still, not living up to the potential for various reasons. But as a political aspiration, it's important that new vehicles, led by China largely, but new vehicles are emerging for different types of multilateral relationships and dialogues. And interestingly, sorry, you can't necessarily see it, it's a little bit too small here, but in the middle, the only three countries in the middle who are part of all of these groups are China, Russia, and Iran. And I raise this because in 1998, Brzezinski, the former US National Security Advisor, this was his big fear. He said, the most dangerous scenario would be a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran. Not out of a sudden love for one another, but out of a shared opposition to the predominant power, aka the US. And I share this because Africa needs to understand that we are seeing changes not seen in 100 years. We're seeing a shift in the geopolitical allegiances. We saw this after, the Ukraine vote, how half of the African continent was unwilling to go with the US line and condemn Russia. We saw this with how most of them were unwilling to support sanctions against Russia. And so right now, and sorry, this is not explained because these are groupings of the global South that we are characterizing based on certain characteristics. But it'll be explained if you keep following us and check out Tricontinental Institute for Social Research in January. There are various groupings who have various characteristics to advance various interests. But what we do share in common in the global South, I think we are 147 countries. I need to double check that. But there are shared common interests around multilateralism, around modernization, around global South-led innovation, around de-dollarization, digital sovereignty, environmental justice, a whole host of things that do kind of bring us together and are an important basis for us to try to struggle together against the historical hegemony of the West that was created through the rampant exploitation of the global South. But I will say, and I'm ending on a Marx quote from the 18th Brumaire, is that China, much like humankind, enters into history not of our own making. So humans make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. And so the last thing I want to end on is that most of you know this. China, prior to the interventions of the UK, etc., the beginning of the Opium Wars in 1840, has been a relatively insular society. They haven't had the same history of engagement with other countries. Yes, we had Zheng He, the admiral, who went out for a little bit, but it was a relatively short period of time. And so all the international relationships that China is forming today are relatively new in the scheme of things. And so there's a lot of learning that goes with it. And I think that China is learning very quickly, is adapting very quickly. We saw this from, within a space of 5 years, about 6 years ago, where we went from the, I don't want to use this word, but the docile diplomat kind of thing, to the wolf warriors, where China was willing to defend themselves in international circles. And so I think we do need to not only think about that, Oussama said this, that there's an imbalance in relationships between North African countries and China, but this imbalance is an inheritance created by 500-600 years of Western humiliation of the entire world. And so they enter into history on a stage of history not of their making. And part of that, as Carlos said, is we need to have a plan in Africa. We need to, I work with social movements who are hoping to gain the Zambian presidency in the next 10 years. And those are the people who are hopefully then going to advance the interests of the people of Africa, of the average or the ordinary people of Africa. And you can't understand China if you don't understand this in the bigger historical context, one. And two, even if it's limited, what China has given Africa is a choice. Up until the late 90s, we still had to beg for a small share of the wealth that was stolen from us through the form of conditional loans that essentially totally restructured our economies and retained our dependency. The dream of Nkrumah, which he was cooed for, was a continental economy, a continental structural change where that level of unity would allow for the level of development in terms of scale that we haven't been able to achieve. China is able to achieve what it did because of the scale of its society, the scale of its productive capacities. And so part of the work I also am part of, sorry, I didn't give you a good bio, Karina, but I'm also part of a group called, Pan-Africanism Today, and we coordinate, about like 80 different social movements, left organizations in the African continent. And understanding China's development would help, I think, to revive and revitalize the Pan-Africanist project, because China shows there's a material basis for ensuring development through that kind of level of scale. And the last thing I'll say is that we need to revive the historical feeling of our common interests, because even though China says it in all its papers and documents, they haven't built the what they say in Latin America, the mystica of our shared destiny in many ways, because it should mean something that when Nkrumah in Ghana was cooed, he was on his way to Vietnam, and the person who delivered the news to him was Zhou Enlai, Premier Zhou Enlai, who was waiting outside. As he landed, he's thinking to himself, or I imagine he was thinking to himself, how am I going to tell the president of Ghana, the first independent state, that there has been a coup and he's no longer in power? And he has been cooed because he was trying to develop or pursue an alternative form of development that centered on African people's needs outside of the Western model of development, in quotes. I think, yeah, I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Mikaela. That was really, really a brilliant and powerful presentation. And, I really thank you for rooting it also in, your experiences of doing political education and organizing with labor movements, with socialist parties, and thinking about how to revive those historical connections and, build upon them between China, communist China, and the Pan-African movements and struggles and socialist movements on the African continent. and reviving the sort of Bandung era, the spirit of the tricontinental, the Afro-Asian solidarity that you discussed, and thinking about China also as a model, like what can be learned. I like this dialectical approach as well, because so often, we have these, very reductionist accounts of China, which don't sort of, which assume China is a sort of static actor, rather than thinking about it in relation to these this geopolitical context that you did such a great job of elaborating. Most importantly, thinking about the role of U.S. imperialism and how that shapes the geopolitical context. And I also appreciate that you brought in the question about the military, the difference between U.S. military presence versus Chinese military relative absence, and the very different examples in terms of spending and investments into militarization. And we know U.S. imperialist militarization and interventions is is a response to crises of accumulation that you've talked about, and that this and this is Ali Kadri put it as accumulation through waste. It's also a key engine of U.S. capital accumulation. And so there are real differences in the Chinese model and the U.S. model. And as you said, what you're looking at is you're less concerned with, is China socialist or a market economy, but rather, how did they do it? How did they improve people's lives? How did they make such incredible leaps in reducing poverty, improving people's livelihoods without the kind of theft, violence, theft, and conquest that characterizes the Western capitalist development model? And so, I really appreciate all the connections that you made. So without further ado, we'll move into the questions. I'm going to pass the floor to Agnes, and looking forward to hearing the discussion.
Karina, thank you so much. Before we begin the questions, I really just want to thank all of the presenters for their incredible and actually very, very inspiring presentations. And you just opened up so many things for me to go and to read and find out more. Also, thank you for Karina and Ying and all the other organizers, and for setting up the conference, and also for allowing me to be a part of it. To get started with the questions, our first question is for Oussama. You discussed the imbalanced relations between Africa and China. How do you think this imbalance can be addressed? Could it be addressed under the current capitalist global order? And does it require changes on the economic logic that is guiding all these economic activities as well?
شكرا. نعم، هناك اختلال واضح قلت في العلاقات ما بين الصين وإفريقيا، وهذا الاختلال بالأساس عائد إلى بنية المجال في إفريقيا وفي بلدان إفريقيا. المجال في إفريقيا من حيث الموانئ، من حيث المطارات، من حيث البنية التحتية الصناعية، هو مجال غير مندمج.
Yeah, I did highlight the imbalance in the relationship between Africa and China, and when it comes to the industrial infrastructure or industrial tissue, ports and airports, it is a space that is not integrated.
مسألة ثانية أنه لابد من تنسيق بين البلدان المغاربية والبلدان الإفريقية في سياسات موحدة تجاه الصين، على اعتبار أن الصين الآن تتعامل مع البلدان الإفريقية كبلدان غير موحدة، تتعامل مع البلدان الإفريقية في إطار علاقات ثنائية وليس علاقات موحدة. وغياب الاستراتيجية الإفريقية وغياب تصور مشترك للبلدان الإفريقية يجعل من قدرة هذه البلدان ضعيفة في التفاوض مع الصين.
And the second thing is that there are no negotiations between China and Africa as a continent, but these are bilateral negotiations between China and particular African states, and this lack of a unified bargaining position for African states leaves them in a weak position vis-a-vis China.
والمسألة الثانية أن هناك العلاقات مع الاتحاد الأوروبي تجعل من العلاقات مع الصين مختلة. هناك يعني سيطرة واضحة لللوبي الأوروبي أو اللوبي الفرنكوفوني الذي تربطه علاقات تجارية قوية مع أوروبا، الذي تربطه علاقات ثقافية ومتأثر بالفكر الأورو مركزي. هذا اللوبي يمنع من أي محاولة تطوير العلاقات في اتجاه الصين، ويمنع من علاقات يعني تقوية الاقتصاد الذي يتجه نحو الصين.
And the third aspect is the integration of the African continent in European economy, and the power of the European lobbies in preventing any major relations between African states and China.
مهم جدا أن تسعى الصين إلى تطوير مشاريع البنية التحتية، لكن الأفضل أن تقوم بذلك من خلال عملية الاستثمار، حيث يبقى الاستثمار الصيني في استثمار ضعيف جدا، وهو يعتمد على الصفقات العمومية بدل الاستثمارات الخارجية.
And in my opinion, it is important to have this infrastructural sort of projects realized by China, but I see it as more beneficial if these were done as foreign direct investment by China as opposed to public enterprise contracts.
أيضا ليس العمل فقط على تصدير السلع الأفريقية لشمال أفريقيا، بل محاولة أن تعدل هذا الميزان التجاري المختل من خلال المواد ضعيفة ذات القيمة المضافة الضعيفة التي تصدرها بلدان شمال أفريقيا، مثل البترول، مثل الفوسفات في تونس والمغرب، وتعويضها بمواد أخرى يعني تجعل من الميزان التجاري نوعا ما يعني مقبول نوعا ما.
And to redress the trade imbalance in the sense that China should not just treat Africa as a market for its goods, but rather be more attentive to redressing the trade imbalance and move away from the reliance on only raw materials and products of low added value.
نعم فقط.
Thank you so much for that answer. And you mentioned a lot of important things, including the role of infrastructure projects and direct projects. And I think that's the perfect segue for our next question, really which is a combination of two questions for Carlos that deal with manufacturing and deal with industrialization. And those questions are that you mentioned two countries that are struggling with debt owed to China. Who are those countries? And has China rescheduled these debts with more favorable terms in terms of interest rates and due dates? And that question was from David Schwartzman. And related to that, Petrus asks, it sounds as if industrialization is predicated on manufacturing for and exporting to Western markets. Is there no case to be made for internally targeted industrialization?
Yeah, thank you for the two questions. On the debt question, I would refer to the work that has been done by the China-Africa Research Initiative in Johns Hopkins University by the team of Professor Deborah Brautigam. They've looked at this whole issue for many years now. They've debunked some of the stories about the extent to which Chinese lenders have created these situations of debt distress. The evidence suggests that most situations of debt distress have been linked to the proliferation of different lenders rather than just China itself. It is true that China is dominant in a number of countries as a bilateral provider of official credit, But of course, as we know, this is not the only form of debt in many African countries. So that's the first thing, that there has been a little bit of exaggeration of the role of China in these situations. In terms of the countries that have suffered most, I would mention particularly Zambia and Ghana, just simply because these are two examples of countries that defaulted on debt, Zambia in 2021 and Ghana in 2022, for quite different reasons and with different creditors. In the case of Ghana, it's much more related to financial markets. And in the case of Zambia, indeed, exposure to Chinese debt was greater, but that was not the reason why they defaulted. They defaulted essentially on external debt to other sources of credit. Not surprisingly, that happened pretty much around the time of the pandemic and the post-pandemic period, when the interest rates started to rise. The capacity of these governments to repay some of the debt that were already in a situation of difficulties was very, very limited. So these are the countries that suffer the most at that time. There has been also a lot of representation of the situation in Kenya in relation to the famous railway project, which was generating a lot of debt. And by and large, what we've found is that Chinese debt relief has happened, and certainly there is a good example in 2020, 2021, quite substantial amounts of debt that were renegotiated with new terms and conditions, a lot of that which was then translated into interest-free loans and so on. The problem with that is that it's really difficult to get precise information on the terms of these debt relief packages, unlike the case of the Paris Club and in other Western donor creditor groups, where you have this information published. So there's a lot of speculation that has happened primarily because of this lack of transparency on some of these deals. But there's no doubt there has been debt relief, not least because the Chinese financial institutions were exposed to some of these repayment problems. One outcome of that, by the way, is that when you look at the trends in Chinese official loans, especially from agencies like Exim Bank, you do see quite a substantial drop in the last 3-4 years. And of course, the pandemic and all that was an important driver, but it's not only that. So clearly, there has been a rethinking and rebalancing of many of these agencies, many of these institutions, in terms of how much exposure they're prepared to take in the following years. On the question of industrialization, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, I actually say that Nigeria and Ethiopia were a good example of contrast. The reality is that the initial waves of Chinese manufacturing investors in a number of African countries did not go there to export. In fact, they went there seeking market opportunities within those countries, i.e. what I call import substitution, industrialization kind of investments. What sort of subsectors do they invest in? Primarily two kinds of subsectors. One of very basic manufacturing goods, consumer goods, such as, flip-flops or shoes, very basic ones, and building materials industry. The building materials industry has been one that has been booming on the back of a large infrastructure, finance, and building. So a lot of that would be an example of internally oriented or internal market oriented type of investments. And these were primarily driven by Chinese entrepreneurs who saw these opportunities, private entrepreneurs who saw, some of them, by the way, traders, involved in the import-export business, and they saw these opportunities precisely because they were traders and they could see the kinds of things that were being imported from China, and they thought, we can produce them here and in better conditions. So Ethiopia, in a sense, is more of an exception than the rule, where the Ethiopian government deliberately formulated an industrial policy which was driven by two primary imperatives. One broad imperative, which was structural change, transformation, nationalization. But apart from that, two imperatives were job creation. So they targeted investments for particular types of industries, labor-intensive industries that would create jobs for young women, particularly, and foreign exchange generation. Ethiopia is a foreign exchange constrained economy. Has always been struggling with foreign exchange. It's not rich in natural resources. It's not like Angola that is swimming in oil, and Angola can just afford to import whatever they want as long as the oil prices are very high. Ethiopia has never been able to do that. So one of the most important objectives of industrial policy was precisely to attract manufacturing investors that had sufficient experience in global production networks. And the way they did that was quite interesting. Rather than doing tours and hanging around China and Vietnam, Bangladesh, or India and trying to persuade these manufacturing firms, they went straight to the buyers. They know that in the textile and apparel industry, it's an industry that is very much dominated by a bunch of big buyers such as Inditex, Zara, H&M, PVH, etc. And what the Ethiopian state did was following this policy of building verticality, which was persuade the buyers first, ask the buyers to bring the supply chains, at least the sort of la creme de la creme of the supply chains, which is exactly what some of these companies do. H&M, certainly Vogue, PVH went and persuaded some of the leading suppliers from Indonesia, from China, of course, from Bangladesh, and from Sri Lanka to go and invest in Ethiopia's industrial parks. And that way, the Ethiopian government made sure that they didn't just attract investments into the textile and apparel sector, but they attracted higher quality suppliers, higher quality investors, rather than cowboys. So in that sense, it was a pretty clever strategy.
Carlos, thank you for that answer. And again, for your very, very interesting and very unique economic perspective on the relationship between China and the African continent. Moving on to Mikaela. Mikaela, again, with another unique perspective, more with a historical perspective, and the questions we have are very of a historical perspective. The first question is from Zhang Ling, who wants to know more about the Sino-African relations during the socialist era, especially how might that legacy, the legacy of the socialist relations, be revived today into contemporary social activism. And also from Michael Kapade, there's been a lot of speculation and a lot of talk about China relenting from its wolf warrior approach. And there are a lot of, political pundits who are speaking about a decline in China's growth. What is your opinion about this narrative? What do you have to say about this narrative? And why do you feel it's so important for the West right now to have this particular narrative?
Wait, sorry, can you say the last part again after wolf warriors?
I apologize. So in addition, China, and the other part of that is that there's a lot of experts, a lot of political pundits asking about a decline in China's growth. And what do you have to say about this narrative of this decreasing influence of China? And why do you think it's so important for the West right now to make this argument?
Okay. Thank you. Great questions. And I also have a question for Carlos. Am I allowed to ask? I know that's maybe uncouth. Because part of what I also think is really interesting about the death trap narrative is that, of course, it's not as if any kind of historical context is given for those particular countries. And I want to know with Angola, for example, Angola exited a civil war in 2002. They had a president who had billions and billions of money, not billions, millions and millions of money going out to offshore accounts. It was a deep level of corruption in the country that was basically removing any of the taxes that would have gone back into the country, and hence pushed Angola into a situation in which, from my understanding, where they do need to get these large levels of loans from Angola. So that's my one question, is there's also an absence of context based on the specificity of those countries, and what is the reason they end up going for higher levels of loans, and why that is. So my question to Carlos, I'm sorry, that was uncouth, but okay, one is that I saw the question in the Q&A section, and one is that as a socialist, I definitely got a bit of a re-education when I came to China around the question of the Deng period, of the opening up period. The person in the comments said, what Ling said that, the neoliberal shift. And I sort of disagree now after learning more, because at the moment of the opening up, so prior to the opening up, we had a huge boost to the economy of China, was that there were 156 strategic Soviet projects that were done in China that helped to, stimulate and catalyze various economic development. So that was an external, assistance. But by 78, with the waning of the Soviet Union, China needed to figure out another way of getting economic stimulus so that they could increase their productivity. And it was a calculated risk. I mean, Deng says, pauperism is not socialism. He speaks about how, because I was like, oh, Deng was a reformist, but actually I think he was a true Marxist. He understood the particular moment he was in, and he said, listen, if we're going to increase the productivity, if we're going to get the levels of development in research and technology and infrastructure, we're going to have to make a calculated compromise by opening up if we're really going to stimulate the economy. And I think his words were, let a few get rich. Let a few get rich, and then we'll deal with the consequences. Because I'm sorry, there are a lot of orthodox leftists in South Africa, for example, who are like, China compromised, they messed up, they decided to go capitalist. And I think it's an error and a mistake, because socialism isn't about pauperism. We want to increase the advancement of our society as much as possible. And now we're seeing it in the Xi period, where those of you who follow China closely, every single week there's a news item about somebody, one of the tigers or the flies, who gets investigated for corruption. We've had leaders of the banks, of the military, of almost every sector of society. This anti-corruption campaign that Xi has led is part of this. We have to correct some of the excesses that happened during the period. So I'm sorry, that's not part of the question, but I think right now, I think Xi is one of the most interesting political leaders of our time, because against the tide of many officials and of course capitalists, Comrade Jack Ma, he has the eve of going public of the what's called IPO, but before they went for a public offering, the Chinese state said, sorry, no, the practices you're having around data mining are against our values, and it hugely dented their profits. Not as much as necessarily could have been done, but a significant amount of money was basically taken away from them in the moment where the state intervened on the private sector. And I think that is something that we don't see in the rest of the world. And so that is an important signifier that there are excesses that occurred because of the opening up period, but in the moment, it was a necessary calculation in order to develop to the point at which right now we have them as the leading economy of the world in GDP PPP terms. Man, the first thing I did when I came to China in May was I took the train, the high-speed train from Beijing to Shanghai. The same trip that in Sweden, the same distance, it takes you 12 hours to travel. Here you're doing it in 4.5 hours. I mean, that's like sci-fi for the African continent. So I just wanted to make that point about the so-called neoliberal era. I think the opening up was a calculated risk that has had huge benefits. Then in terms of reviving the spirit, I mean, you guys should be able to see this, and I follow this on Bilibili and Chinese social media, as the young people in China are really patriotic. They are extremely patriotic. And that doesn't come out of the so-called, indoctrination from the state. They are living a materially better life than their parents, their grandparents, any of their forefathers. They are, China has one of the most highly educated female population. The highest rates in terms of people going to tertiary education are women in China. All of my colleagues, 90% of them are actually women between the ages of 24 to 45. Walking in China at 3 a.m., I've never felt so safe in my whole entire life. Like, there's a materially different basis in which they are understanding themselves. But, and I think this is a question of their communication strategy is relatively, it's not as strong as it should be. For example, I don't know why there's not a museum of China internationalism and the history in China. They're really good museums. The one in Beijing on Japanese aggression is excellent. But rebuilding, I think that popular political feeling of being connected to the global South has been absent, largely due to their, again, civilizational state, centuries of being relatively isolated. So it is, that stands in the way. But I do think that, as the question was saying, how are we reviving or reigniting this legacy of, collective experience? I think it is being revived right now. There are more young people who know about Africa, who know about the various countries and various situations than have been in a very long time. There are a lot of young people on social media, influencers, who are speaking about Africa. Like there's this one guy called, I think his name is Big Face, who he will be like, okay, who is Gaddafi? What happened to Gaddafi? What's the situation of Libya? And no one in the US is asking who's Gaddafi and what's the situation of Libya, for good reason, since the US messed us up by the illegal bombing of Libya in 2011. But even, and this is the last point I'll raise, is there is a higher level of political consciousness in the society that I have only seen in places like Venezuela or Cuba amongst young people. The third is in China, because people are more interested in politics, and particularly now with what happened in Gaza and the, Israeli Zionist state's murder, assassination, genocide of thousands, over 15,000 people. Lots of young people are asking, why is this happening? This is incredulous to us. And this is a big politicization moment, not only in China, you've seen in the US that a lot of young people are finally waking up to the role of the US in Israel and its continued pursuit of these levels of violence. So I would say that I'm giving context, but one is that this is already being revived. Two is that because of the looking outward, China is getting, the young people are more aware of what's happening. They lack political nuance, of course, and that's clear from the fact that, Kissinger is still a hero in China. But I think that the closeness that they get with the global South, they will be forced, as they have been, to re-educate themselves around these kinds of questions and the role of the West.
Mikaela, thank you for your answer to both of the questions and the incredible things that you have been saying and the message that you're bringing. I think we've got to the time where we just have final remarks. So if I will start with Oussama, for all of the speakers, if you had just one final thing for all of us to share or to think about as the seminar ends.
فقط للحوصلة أقول أنه الدور الصيني في إفريقيا هو دور مهم جدا، وهو دور مطلوب، وهو يمثل تصور آخر مخالف للتصور الغربي.
By way of conclusion, I'd like to say that China's role in Africa is very important and very much needed, and it offers a welcome alternative to that of the United States.
لكن في نفس الوقت مهم جدا الابتعاد عن الخطاب الرومانسي وتنسيب الدور الصيني في إفريقيا.
And at the same time, it may behoove us to move away from the romantic discourses about China's role.
فالأرقام تقول أنه الحضور الصيني هو ذو قدرة تشغيلية ضعيفة جدا.
Because the numbers tell a story that in terms of employment, the numbers are very weak.
أن مستوى التصنيع أيضا في البلدان الإفريقية ضعيف جدا.
And that goes also for manufacturing.
وأن عملية نقل التكنولوجيا من الشركات الصينية للشركات المحلية التي ستساهم في النهضة الإفريقية هي أيضا ضعيفة.
And so is the case for the transfers of technology to local enterprises that should contribute to the industrialization on the continent.
مسألة الشراكة ومسألة الموازنة ما بين القوى العالمية للبلدان الأفريقية هي مسألة مهمة جدا.
The question of balancing and partnerships is very key and important to African countries.
لكن معظم المشاريع الصينية في أفريقيا أو معظم يعني أدوات الوساط الصينية التي تعتمدها في أفريقيا هي وسائل لصناعة الصورة إلى حدود الآن هي أكثر من وسائل الشراكة.
But up until now, the way China deployed itself in Africa seemed to be more about image building than about partnership building.
أيضا لا يقع اللوم على الصين فقط، هناك لوم أيضا للبلدان الأفريقية التي لا تمتلك استراتيجية ورؤية موحدة في التواصل مع الصين.
But this is not to put the blame solely on China. There is a responsibility on Africans who lack a unified strategic vision.
حيث أن أفريقيا ذات المجال الغير مندمج والبنية التحتية الضعيفة ستقودها عملية الشراكة مع الصين إلى نتائج مختلة لحساب الصين لا لحساب أفريقيا.
The lack of African integration and lack of coordination will lead eventually into these imbalances being deepened in favor of China.
إلى حدود الآن مستوى الاستثمار الصيني في أفريقيا ومستوى التبادلات التجارية مع أفريقيا يعكس ضعف أهمية هذه القارة بالنسبة للصين على الأقل من زاوية اقتصادية.
These trade imbalances are indicators of ممكن تعود أسامة؟
إلى حدود الآن أقول أن ضعف الأرقام التجارية مع أفريقيا ويعكس أهمية الصين، أهمية أفريقيا الضعيفة في نظر الصين.
The weakness of numbers in terms of trade and exchange indicate that the weak position of Africa relative to China.
فالصين تنظر لأفريقيا في كثير من الأحيان كوسيلة لعلاقات تجارية أكبر مع الاتحاد الأوروبي ووسيلة أيضا لمنافسة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية.
So far, China's approach to Africa is instrumental in the sense that it is a tool to reach European markets and to compete with the United States.
وبالتالي نحن مصلحتنا كأفارقة هو في موازنة العلاقات بين يعني العلاقات التقليدية والصين.
So from our perspective as Africans, our interests lie in the balancing of our relationships and redressing these imbalances.
وذلك إلى حين أن تثبت الصين أن خطاب الشراكة ربح ليس مجرد خطاب، بل يجب أن تترجمه من خلال الاستثمارات، من خلال التشغيل، ومن خلال بناء اقتصاد وتنمية حقيقية في أفريقيا.
And that is until China in some ways proves that the win-win rhetoric and the rhetoric of partnership is more than just a discourse, but rather is translated into a material, concrete, and equitable partnership.
شكرا.
Thank you.
Carlos, your final remark?
Thank you. So let me just highlight some of the key points, and also I'll try to answer Mikaela's question tangentially. I mean, the first thing is there is something new, and which explains partly some of the excitement and the romantic views, as Oussama put it, of some people when analyzing this increasing engagement in Chinese-African relations, which is that there are things that are happening now that haven't happened for at least 30, 40 years in many countries. So, and I've mentioned two basic things. There hasn't been barely any finance for economic infrastructure for a long time. And, you know, the main culprit is the World Bank. The World Bank is the main agency for infrastructure financing since the 1970s in most African countries. They've been interested in other things, you know, like financing policy reform, rather than roads and ports and stuff like that. So that's new, and therefore it does change the status quo quite substantially, and it does create the basic foundations for something that could resemble a re-aspiration to industrialize, at least in some countries. The second thing is because of what's happening in China, especially for Chinese capital, both state and private capital, there's clearly a momentum of opportunities for some of this capital to move to new places. So, you know, this whole notion of global China does have implications for overseas economic development, and some African countries have been on the receiving end. Of course, the outcomes of these relations, as I said in the presentation, depend very much on the agency, particularly of African states and African elites. And therefore, how is it that they leverage these different interests and opportunities to deliver something that resembles economic development in their own countries? And the third point is precisely that in order to make sense of all that, one needs to pay attention to variation within the African continent. And I think drawing key contrasts between different countries, not only in terms of how different African governments have been leveraging these kinds of opportunities, but also how Chinese actors, whether it's financiers, investors, Chinese state capital, how they've adapted to quite different contexts. You know, they've basically been constantly learning and experimenting in different African contexts and behaving in slightly different ways depending on this context. So it's very difficult to actually paint a very general and essentially the image of this is what China-Africa is like. And the final point is that there is a lot of contradictions. The problem is that people who engage with these debates seem usually unable to hold two seemingly opposing ideas in their head at the same time. And I'll give the example of Angola, just going back to Mikaela's question. So on the one hand, yes, Angola, you're right. Angola is, you know, an example of mass-scale theft on the part of Angolan elites, primarily in the time of Dos Santos' presidency, and how Dos Santos created a network which basically extracted resources from different sectors, particularly from the state oil company, Sonangol, the banking sector that was created on the back of unpaid loans, etc. So yeah, we're talking about millions and millions of dollars. They even created a sovereign fund from the oil revenues, which was managed by Dos Santos' son, and they managed to, you know, divert and, you know, make, I don't know, 500 million disappear. Now, all that can happen at the same time as that same Angolan elite and that same Angolan government has been able to leverage billions of credit from Chinese finance sources to do what? To actually deliver tangible public goods. Why? Because of the terms of these loans. The Angolan government never saw a single dollar from these credit lines from China. You know, all these billions of dollars of credit line were directly paid to Chinese contractors, which, by the way, fiercely competed for those projects. So there was no lack of competition for the building of those projects. But the payment for those projects was done through China, directly from those loans, and they never had any chance of being stolen. So the only thing that Angolan elites could do with the Chinese loans would be to add little bits and pieces of, you know, a few $1 million here and there in contracts, where they could add companies and subcontracting deals so that some of their friends, etc., could extract some money from these loans. So interestingly, what happened in Angola is that at the same time as you had the kind of theft that Mikaela was referring to, there was one of the most massive physical infrastructure reconstruction efforts that we have seen in most of sub-Saharan Africa since independence. Okay, we're talking thousands of kilometers of road, ports, airports, what have you. So again, big contradictions, and that shows how African agency actually shapes the way these opportunities are managed and taken advantage of. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mikaela, your final remark.
Gracias to Carlos for answering my question. Appreciate it. And shukran to Oussama for your contributions. I will end on 2 points. Thank you, and I hope you will ask me. I have a lot of good friends, great friends who work on China-Africa related things. I know Grieve Chelwa was unable to join us, and he's one of my colleagues who has done great work. So if you have any people you need, I know great people who can contribute to the future of this seminar project. The other is, I also want to relate this to African agency. In 2021, I was at the China-Africa Forum in Senegal, in Dakar. And a friend and I, or a colleague and I, were basically covering the event and trying to understand, what is the character of the African participation. Africa's median age is around 19 years old. When we looked at the Congolese delegation, Congo, which has like a 90% youth unemployment rate, the delegation who was representing the Congolese people was over 70 years old, most of them. And I'm not ageist, I'm not discriminatory, but logistically, how is it that they, in a young continent, we still don't have the political, proportional representation of the actual people? It was shocking to me that I spoke to one woman because I was trying to get contact of the foreign minister, and I asked her, "Hey, I see you're having a badge of Congo, and I would like to. Me and my colleague want to interview the foreign minister. Can you give me some information about what you guys have been doing?" And she said, "Oh, I don't actually work in the foreign ministry. I just came along. I know somebody in the foreign ministry." That is the level of political, or moral degradation of our leaders. And sadly, we have a long road ahead to advance the national liberation struggles that began in the 1800s, in the 1940s, etc., to ensure that we actually have responsible representatives who are at the negotiating table when it comes to China. And I raised this because, as Kruma said, and some people would disagree, but I agree, Kruma said, seek ye first the political kingdom. Politics leads in these conversations. And if we don't have, how is it that Cuba, who's been under siege, who's been sanctioned under embargo for over 60 years, is somehow still able to create 3 viable vaccines to the COVID pandemic, to the COVID virus? How was that possible? We need to ask ourselves on the African continent, despite the economic limitations, there was the political will to do something about it. And that is what is lacking on the African continent, and particularly not shown in the conversation about China-Africa, because China can only do so much. But when I was reading that document of the pledges, the agreements between China-Africa at the China-Africa Forum, it shocked me that even at the level of aesthetics, it was clearly a Chinese written document. It had the Chinese, style of the foreign ministry, etc. But they couldn't even, Africa was so lethargic, our leaders, that they couldn't even throw in Ubuntu, much like Tianxia is this concept of, humanity. And they couldn't even anecdotally throw in a little bit of Africanness and push for an African position. And this goes back to the usurpation and the coup against the Third World in Chile, the usurpation and coup against the Pan-African continental project in 1969 with Nkrumah, that we are yet in the continent to revive and advance. And we won't have a balance of relationships with China until we have, a domestic project that's represents the people and is viable. If Cuba can create a soberanía and the various COVID can improve HIV health, can improve, various aspects that they don't have the economic basis to do, then we should be able to build viable political projects that can advance our kind of economic and developmental interests.
Thank you. Again, all your presentations were so incredible, and your final remarks as well. It was an absolute pleasure to be a part of this. So I will then turn it to Karina.
Thank you so much, Agnes. And I just want to thank the panelists again. This has been a real tour de force. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. Really, it's extensive and rich knowledge of the history as well as the geopolitical context in which Africa's relations, China's relations with the African continent are unfolding. This discussion has really reminded us of the importance of a dialectical approach, and you all have, in your own ways, presented really a dialectical, materialist, and nuanced accounts of China's relations with the African continent at the current conjuncture, and have given us cogent and compelling analysis that not only helps to advance our intellectual endeavors, but also is relevant to addressing these pressing political and economic concerns that emerge as we confront the global resurgence of fascism, most visibly demonstrated, as Mikaela referenced, in the genocidal war on Gaza, as well as the climate crisis, of course. But despite the sort of dystopian future that all this portends and is already here in many ways, as we see in Gaza and many other people in the globe, for the people, many people in the global South, as well as the global South and the global North. But your presentations, I think, have also given us reason to hope that another world is possible. Another model of development is possible, that we can learn from these histories of solidarity, of alternative development models, and that we can think about alternative models of development that are not based, as you said, Mikaela, on the violence, exploitation, and dispossession. And that these are possible not only for the African continent, but globally. So I also thank you for giving us that hope. So I also want to thank again you all, the brilliant panelists here, as well as from the first panel, and especially to all of those who have joined us, despite it being very late or very early in the morning, depending on how we look at it. I want to thank again my colleague Ying, as well as Dong, for all the logistical support and tech that she provided for organizing this webinar, as well as technical support from IT, from our amazing student moderators, Michael and Agnes again, to Brahim for his amazing translation, as well as again to the NSSR Faculty Research Fund and our institutional sponsors, and particularly to Grace Ho and Silvina Palacio.